and I was a couple minutes late, so maybe you talked about this. Two things, and thank you for opening up this dialogue, by the way. This is really critical, because we're coming back to it again. I want to take it back to history for a minute, right? Sort of the feminist masquerade, taking us back to 1975 film, you know, Doan and Mulvey, talking about these issues of spectatorship versus sort of representation, and you seem to have brought it to a context of contemporary black women and sort of this production of the self. I wonder what you think of then with regard, and really I'd like for you to, maybe if you could talk a little, if you haven't already, about that connection, and what the difference, how is the question different than sort of the post-masquerade feminists, if you would use that, the question that they ask, masquerade, why didn't it work, you know, or did it work, you know, what's the difference between dealing with it then and sort of now, because it's your black feminist, and then a more practical question, what's the difference between a Nicki Minaj and, say, a Lil' Kim? Just to throw that into the mix.
Okay. All right. I'll start with your first one and thinking about this notion of spectatorship and representation and why this conversation, I think, is somewhat different, right? I think what, in fact, makes this context different, one, of course, I think, is kind of the racializing of the conversation in a contemporary way, in a contemporary context, and the peculiar kind of industry that has been formed around this, right? That we are now more aware of who exactly spectators are and what those narratives are commenting upon, right? And that you have, I think, the internet makes a particularly interesting kind of phenomenon in terms of the circulation of these images and the ability to view them privately, right? That no longer are we necessarily talking about public sphere kinds of engagements, right? But the black female body being gazed upon in private spheres, in the home, on your computers, on the internet, right? So there's a way in which you can engage without that same wondering of what will be thought about that, right? That performance of spectatorship is no longer a public performance, right? Spectatorship is very much so, can be limited to the self and the object or subject that you're engaging with. So I think that particularly speaks to a new kind of moment in how we're thinking about this notion of technology and really the creation of an entire industry that is primarily focused on, you know, black female bodies, right? That now these women in many ways are authors of, right? They're creating their websites, they're releasing magazines and calendars and going to parties and hosting these fees that builds upon a certain notion of their body being desirable and a commodity. To speak to your second question, the difference between Lil' Kim and Nicki Minaj, wow. That's a dissertation waiting to be written. But I am admittedly a Lil' Kim fan from old Lil' Kim before she did all that.
But that's what Minaj did.
Right, no. And I feel that in addition, I mean, you know, Lil' Kim stated Pamela Anderson was her ideal, right, of beauty, right? So in seeing the blue contacts and the blonde weaves and the breast implants and the various things, right, that also speaks to the messages and kind of signs that we're all still getting within culture about what ideals are, right? That even someone who became popular off the strength of being this around the way girl from Brooklyn, right, still attaches herself to a particular ideal of beauty, right, and never quite felt comfortable in her own skin, right? Then you have someone like Nicki, who I think is actually far more interesting in this kind of conversation because she decidedly becomes a Barbie to become an icon, like to position herself as an icon, right? It's an object that she assumes, not another subject that she's trying to mimic or recreate, but really trying to become the living black Barbie, right? The decided understanding of being an object, right? She's not. I think Lil' Kim was still trying to be a subject within the context of take me seriously as Lil' Kim. I think Nicki Minaj is more conscious of the fact that objectification is, in fact, the goal she's striving for. I think Lil' Kim's aspirations were slightly different, not in terms of being both of them having plastic surgery, but their reasons and motivations behind a lack of understanding of self or self-esteem or whatever we may want to think about in the context of Lil' Kim, versus saying, if I want to be an object that is consuming and perceived as a rapper, that is a kind of different process. I'm not saying either one is less or more problematic.
So then the implications of that for the spectator, it seems like, with the masquerade, regardless as to the intentions or
Mhm.
the agency, which
Right.
is the question that opens up.
Right.
How does that get viewed? Because like Baldwin says, right, the thing we put out there to critique is that thing that
Right.
we risk representing. So
Right.
can a claim be, in terms of that argument, can a claim be made that then that, how is that received?
Right.
In other words, is Minaj received any different? Do we see power operating any different? Are there different, what, what the implications for spectatorship?
Right.
And the use of the black body,
Right.
regardless as to what the intention
Right.
may be.
I mean, I think that's a question. I don't know that I could really answer that, how people are perceiving that. But I do think that, given their kind of history, it is kind of mapped on to Nicki Minaj, right? This history of what the black female body should do within the space of hip hop, right? That she's certainly signifying on that history. One of her first major images released was a recreation of Lil' Kim's hardcore album, Insert, right? That was one of her first majorly circulated images, right? So she is, on many ways, commenting upon this kind of lexicon of black female body positioning as a sexual object and / subject, right? And I think Lil' Kim is also very conscious of that. We see that with a number of other bodies that do that. You see Beyonce often doing a reference of Josephine Baker, right? In a number of her performances, in the way in which she does that, right? She does this whole 100th birthday celebration performance where she does the banana skirt and kind of the see-through transparent top that she does in relation to that. So I think a lot of these women are very conscious of the kind of history of images and bodies and the ways in which they can in turn embody that.